love the countdown. 3, 2, 1, go with the exclamation point.
It's very enthusiastic.
Yeah, man. I am ready. Are you ready to roar?
Yeah. Yeah. Shout out Mark
Yeah.
Claire. Let's roar, kitty cat.
Matt, you and I talked on the phone a couple of times over the last couple of months, and you've been super busy with your life, and obviously a lot of stuff going on in my life, and you've talked about it on the couple of episodes that you've done, and I don't want to rehash what I talked to Pete about. Hopefully, build on it here. But we decided to dust off a little bit, and I'll speak for myself personally, like just kind of get motivated to do this thing, whatever this thing is again. So we thought maybe we'd kind of share a live stream here, and you could put it up on King Pill, and I'll put it up on whatever the heck it is that I'm doing. A rebrand would be really easy if I could we were talking about this a second ago, just motivate myself to sit in front of the computer for 25 minutes and just rebrand it. And every time I think, man, I have 25 minutes, maybe I'll just sit on the back deck and read one of the 300 books that have been accumulating over the last 2 years. And I end up doing that instead. So thank you for pushing me to come back and kind of like hold me, because, every time, doesn't matter who it is, like Jesus Christ himself could be like, I'll be a guest on your show. And I'm like, we could totally do it tomorrow. And so, maybe like kind of what, your thoughts are coming into here and kind of what you like hope to get out of it.
Honestly, I don't really have any expectations. I sort of the same. Like I want to kind of get back in the swing of things. I've done a couple of like people have had me as guests on a couple shows recently, and I realized as I got into it that I was like, man, it just feels good to sit here and just kind of get stuff out of my head. I realize when I don't talk about things out loud that like thoughts start backing up in my head, and it's like my brain just bogs down with all these words that I need to get out. I need to get them out to someone, and it feels like I don't want to be the person that has to talk to other people to be able to think, but it seems like that's kind of what I am. I'm the person that has to talk to other people in order to think. And so I'm kind of figuring out how to embrace that. But it's funny when we're sitting here like talking like this. You were just before we got started here, you were like, well, maybe you do an intro or something like that. And I was like, it's weird to me because we sit and we talk on the phone and it's just completely natural. Hey man, how's it going? Have a conversation. And then you sit down to record a conversation like this, and suddenly there's a third person present. But that third person is faceless. You don't know who it is, but there's someone who's sitting there listening, and you start instinctively talking to, like, now I'm not just talking to you, I'm talking to the other people that I know are going to be listening. And that's a weird thing. It's weird to talk to someone who's there but not there at the same time. And it's completely normal for people that sit and do interviews and have other people on their shows and stuff. And I'm the same way, where I've got a whole list of guests I want to invite on, and I'll sit and I'll listen to their like interviews on other shows. And I'm like, man, this is amazing. I wish I could talk to him. I could ask him this, and that. And I'm like, I know I literally could write to this guy right now and say, like, he follows me on Twitter. I could write to him right now and say, hey, would you come on my show? And I know he would say yes. But for whatever reason, I just haven't done it. I just haven't reached out and done that. And I get comments every so often, hey, when are you guys doing another episode? And I'm like, yeah, it's coming, but I guess just not in the right headspace right now.
Yeah. The prep work that, at least for me, that went into having guests on and writing down questions and making sure we're touching on points, those were things that I wanted the answers. So it was easy for me to write the questions down. And now I'm trying to figure out what questions I want to ask, because I can mostly answer them like on my phone. If I want to know whatever information about whatever thing, like YouTube has a series on it, or somebody that I follow has a series on it, and they've kind of already done the work. Like I talked to a few people about doing maybe like continuing the Bible series that I was doing with Chris Manis. We only did the book of Genesis. Obviously there's 38 more books to go, so we thought about doing more of that, but then I found like people who've done it better. And it's easy for me to just say like, well, why don't you go listen to that guy? Because I'm learning from him. Like, why would I do it? And that's kind of the point where I'm at, where I was talking to you on the phone about where I kind of thought I wanted to take the show, which is continuing a journey. But I think some parts of a journey you kind of take on your own way, alone sort of by nature. And it's hard to, it took me probably 4 years before I finally sat down and started doing You're Talking Over Me. It wasn't like I didn't want to. I just didn't know what to say. And then one day I just did it. So maybe the just doing it part helps me out. But I wanted to start with this. And for some reason, whenever I have like a little bit of a memory block or don't know where to start, I just go to Facebook. And usually the first, it's really the only time I'm ever on Facebook, unless I'm, well, I won't say that on air what I'm doing. It's nothing bad, but it's probably shouldn't say it in public. So I found this, and I'm not going to say the young lady's name, but she put up, the guy in the blue shirt with the coffee mug at the picnic table, and it says "Change my mind," and there's always something just inserted in it. I know the guy. I think we said his name, but
Stephen Crowder.
Oh yeah, Crowder, right? Louder Crowder, right?
Yeah.
It says Roe being overturned is why you need an AR-15. Change my mind. And I went, man, if that doesn't just sum up, for me anyway, the reason I don't ever go on Facebook in one meme, it would be like that somebody would think that that was interesting and not completely boring and ridiculous. So maybe that's like a place to start, because you and I both talked about kind of modernity and enlightenment being a mistake and things along those lines. And what actually, we talked in depth about this, maybe our first or second time that we talked a couple of years ago, about kind of where the quote unquote problem started. Was it, and by problem, I mean, like, we looked at COVID and we looked at quote unquote COVID tyranny and libertarian, essentially doctrinal collapse. And we're like, well, how did we get here? Where did it start? What was like the catalyst? I'll be a little provocative and say it was Augustine, but without giving anybody any caveats or like context of why I'm saying that. But that's kind of been my exploration, and it pushed me into Orthodox Christianity kind of as a result. It wasn't like I was looking for that. And then trying to then figure out what type of culture do I want to live in? Why do I want to live in that culture? And why don't we have it? And just to kind of start, I would say I would like to live in a Christian culture. 1, 2, what does that mean? And 3, why do I think I don't? Right. So what are your thoughts on that kind of rambling, incoherent start that I sort of led?
It's interesting. One thing you said early about the just kind of talking through it, and you started out doing the show because you had questions that you wanted to ask, and now you're kind of like, well, when I have those questions, I can just look it up and I can get it answered without having to do a show and everything. And when I started doing the show, it was because I had stuff that was on my mind that I wanted to say, that I was saying to people in private chats, Steven in particular, and he was saying, dude, you need to say this stuff publicly. Other people need to hear this. And now we're a year and a half later, and there's a lot of people who are saying all this stuff. So I'm like, well, I don't feel like I have anything new and interesting to contribute to the conversation. I'm kind of, it's like everyone else is saying all the stuff that I was saying. And so now I feel like, okay, I did my job. I got the stuff out there that I was thinking. Now other people are thinking it, and like they can take these ideas and run with them. And I don't have any new ideas to contribute. And there's this like latent part in my psychology, I think, where I feel like if something isn't new, it's not important or interesting or valuable. It like the familiar stuff is boring to me. I want something that's new, that's original, that's cutting edge, that especially if it like catches people off guard or it's edgy or provocative, like those types of things, those are what get me going. So I figure that's what'll get the people going. And so being in that state of mind where I'm like, I don't really have anything to say. I don't have anything new or original to bring. I don't want to just say the same stuff over and over again. It's the irony is not lost on me that at the same time that I've been struggling with that, I've been delving into some of the oldest ideas in the world. If not, I mean, Western civilization isn't the whole world, but like, so these are some of the oldest traditions and ideas that are known to mankind. And those have had such a powerful impact on me. They've completely altered the perspective on the world that I had, to where, to me, like, it doesn't even, once upon a time, it seemed edgy to me to say something like the Enlightenment was a mistake, or talking about a post-liberal world, or those kinds of things. Now those are so common, like that doesn't even seem edgy to me, because my mind has been stuck so far back in the past. And as I'm kind of mulling through all these things, one thing I want to say before we really dive further into some of this stuff is that it's inevitable that if you're someone who has an audience, no matter how big or small, and you talk about stuff that you know that other people are interested in listening to because they want to know more about, it's inevitable that you're going to be considered an authority. And I want to make it very, very clear that I'm not an authority on Orthodox Christianity. I'm not someone who is interested in giving spiritual advice, and I'm not someone who should be seen as someone trying to give spiritual advice. What I'm describing is my own experience, and I'm trying to put these ideas together for myself. And it just so happens that apparently I'm not capable of putting ideas together for myself in my own time. I have to do it like throwing ideas at someone else. That's the way hearing the words come out of my mouth is the way my brain puts it together. So I want to make it clear. I don't want people to see me as an authority or someone who's speaking for the church or anything like that. So that being said, there's this term that I kept coming across that you mentioned when we were on the phone the other day, and the term is Phronema. And it's there isn't really an English equivalent for it. The closest thing you might get would be something like a perspective or a paradigm or a worldview. A state of mind sort of is probably the closest. I can't remember the exact translation of it, but especially within like academic circles within Orthodoxy, they talk about having an Orthodox Phronema, which is essentially seeing the world the way that an Orthodox Christian sees the world. And the way that an Orthodox Christian sees the world is, by and large, drastically different from the way a run-of-the-mill Western American person sees the world. Just completely from the ground up. Fundamental metaphysics and epistemology are just completely different. We live in completely different worlds. And I guess what I've been experiencing over the last few years is a process of I've been going through a transition. I've been transitioning. This is a nice loaded word for you. I've been transitioning from having kind of a generic lib phronema, so to speak, to beginning to take on the Orthodox phronema. And being someone who's born and raised and completely enculturated in the West, and someone who's a converted ox, I don't expect that process is like I'm never going to see the world the way that an Eastern-born cradle Orthodox person would. I'm invariably going to see the world the way that someone who's converted to Orthodoxy sees the world. So it's going to be kind of a bridge between these two worldviews. But all of that being said, then the question you asked, what, like, you said something to the effect of you're sort of beginning to see the world in a new way. You're beginning to like, why do you want to live in a Christian culture, and why don't you live in a Christian culture? Why do you think you don't? That's not something you would have asked yourself a couple of years ago. Like, both of those questions, those are both questions that you wouldn't have thought to yourself really a couple of years ago. And I think that the way that I would frame it up, I guess, is that we're seeing the world through different eyes. We're seeing what the world could be were it to be grounded in different presuppositions, or were it to be grounded upon a different epistemology, were it to be like, if people were to have the awareness. I said when we first started about the idea of having, like, Like you and I are sitting here talking, we're just talking on the phone, we don't think anything of it, and all of a sudden we hit record, and suddenly there's a third person sitting here that we're talking to.
Mm-hmm.
It's similar to that for me, at least. This having this developing orthodox view is that suddenly there's other people in the room. There's a different perspective in the room that's present all the time. And if other people, it feels like if other people had that same metaphysical sense, that same awareness of the entities that are present around us all the time, they would act differently. They would behave differently. They would have different priorities. And as long as I'm, it's like if you're walking around seeing a different world than everybody else who's around you, it's like, do I act as if I'm in the world that everybody else is in, or do I act as if I'm in the world that I'm in? Because if I act as if I'm in the world that I'm in, I'm invariably going to start clashing and running into other people. I mean, on a silly level, like if some people see a bus coming and other people don't see the bus coming, they're going to wind up in very different places. This happens on the metaphysical level.
Yeah.
And it's like suddenly I am aware of a whole bunch of metaphysical buses driving around that other people don't see. And so I'm caught between, do I just start adjusting my own behavior to either avoid or jump on board these different invisible buses and just let other people catch up? Or do I start trying to point them out to people? Do I have an obligation to point to this, this invisible metaphysical bus traffic driving around, to kind of torture the analogy? Do I have an obligation to point to those and try to get other people to notice them? Or do I just start acting as if they're there and wait for other people to notice what's in the negative space? I don't know. That's I've gone super abstract, so let me know if you're tracking with me.
No, I'm totally tracking, and I think about 5 episodes into doing You're Talking Over Me, so May 2020, what I ended up, after a couple stumbles and talking to restaurant people and trying to see where I was going, what initially became sort of the ultimate formula of the show was that people were void of meaning and purpose and trying to find it somewhere. And when you're on, as was slowly revealed to me through talking to folks like yourself and just sort of allowing myself to be in the ether and soak up information, was that we are living in the middle. We are still living in Christendom, right? So the culture of Christianity as a religion, the culture being Christendom. And I like that terminology, and we'll talk later about where I kind of got that from, but I'm sure you can sympathize. We're living in that culture, but we've removed the idea of Christianity from it, but it's still carrying on in the same trajectory. And so people are now trying to either find a version of Christ that sort of works for them to continue not seeing the buses, right? Or they're seeing them and they absolutely love buses, right? But there's to continue to torture the analogy. Buses are great. I can't wait to get hit by another one today, or maybe I should be driving it, hitting other people. So, but we're not seeing it the way it was initially intended to be seen, right? So, you mentioned a couple of years ago would I have asked that question, and I wouldn't have, but I did 25 years ago, right? When I was going through Catholic school, which I did kindergarten through 8th and grew up in the church and did the altar boy thing, and had, all the catechesis, did everything the right way. I mean, as I was told to do it. And growing up in the house I did, where we were encouraged to read and ask questions. And, I really read the Bible. Like I'll say half the Bible memorized, just by the very nature that it was occurring around me all the time, the same way people memorize baseball stats or whatever. And what I was reading, and I've said this too many times, so I won't belabor it for the listeners, but what I was reading was not what I was seeing. I wasn't seeing it from the Catholic Church. I wasn't seeing it from people who said they were Catholics, and I wasn't seeing it from Protestants. And I had a very good concept of Christianity up until Augustine, up until like the 5th century. And then I had a really good understanding of it from Luther to, I don't know, like the Russian Revolution, something like that, like the 1900s. But for some reason, it never occurred to me to talk about that freaking 1,000 years in the middle. And
The Dark Ages.
I don't know why. It's an entire millennium of information that I never even thought to consume that way. It was like when I delved into between 500 and 1500 AD, it was all philosophy and logic. And that's probably another product of growing up in the household I did with, you know, an atheist philosophy professor's father, et cetera, et cetera. But I did ask that question, and I said, this is what I'm reading. And I'm seeing this even in the early church fathers. I'm really not seeing it in Augustine. And nobody even knew who the early church fathers were. And I don't think I called them that. I probably called them by name, like Ignatius or Polycarp or whatever. And nobody knew what I was talking about, and nobody was seeing it that way. So I just went, well, I guess I'm not a Christian. I have this choice and this choice. I don't see either one. So I guess I'm a pagan or a Gnostic or whatever. I read those things and I'm like, well, they're a little bit later, but it seems maybe I'm more like that, you know? So if I had to pick like a real underlying motive for wanting to get back out there and talk to people, it's to sort of show that it doesn't have to be a binary decision. It really isn't even a decision at all. It's a decision between God and not between my particular flavor of Christianity that day. And well, this church doesn't, some of the things they do are a little weird, or they want me to do this and it conflicts with work. So I'm going to go to that one. This one seems super cool and historical, but I don't know, it's a little bit long service. I want to go to this one. And this guy shops at the supermarket, so maybe I'll go to that one because he's my neighbor. And you bounce around and try to figure out why like none of this is working. And then a lot of people end up either atheists or they end up in like a non-denominational sort of feel-good circle group or something where you're basically at a picnic with a bunch of nice people, but like there's no presence of anything there. And so I thought, well, that's like super depressing to think that, and it's no wonder that Western culture has ended up in this nihilistic place, looking to accomplish everything for ourselves. If we feel like the Christian alternative to that is punishment in order to go to heaven, which is such a weird way to look at Christianity, that I don't blame atheists for saying, well, can I just be a good person? No, you have to do this, 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 and this. And you have to do it this way, or maybe this way, but this way. But really, it's about justifying good works, or maybe it's about faith alone, or, you know, is it about infusion, or is it about imputation? And you start breaking these things down. They're like, I just want to be a good person. Like, why do I go to hell for just being a good person if I don't accept Christ? And then there's this whole other thing that has, you know, an unbroken line of tradition that completely excuse all of that, that says all of that is the wrong question. It's all essentially human beings try to rationalize their way into doing as little work as possible. And that comes from, like you said, a really bad presupposition that you had to torture yourself in order to become one with the reason you were created in the first place. And I feel like if, you know, I'm not in any way, and you probably agree with this, trying to tell people that they need to go to their closest Eastern Orthodox church and start worshiping tomorrow, because you probably should not do that. I'm going to say most people listening probably do not want to do that. Not that you don't want, I actually don't want you to do that. But there is a message that you would think somebody was writing a self-help book, an atheist self-help book, that they would find incredibly palatable. That message, if you just like insert God into it, to me is Eastern Orthodox Christianity. It's very simple. It's very heartwarming. It's very loving, and it's very complete. And to me, it seems like the line kind of moving from Augustine and reason and logic and complicating all of these matters and screwing everybody up so that they constantly like answer the wrong questions, build a foundation, create new questions that have to be answered, that create new questions that have to be answered. All of these like illogical presuppositions that lead people to be like, all right, screw all of this, where it's all about reason, logic, there's no God and whatever. Like, you don't need,
Scholasticism is a hell of a drug.
no joke. And you don't need any of that, right? You can actually have a very similar mindset to the person who just wants to be a good person and just tune it just a little bit in another direction. And you'll realize how naturally programmed you are to do this. And that is very freeing, but it's also very terrifying because once you realize how easy it is, you have no excuse not to do it. And that's the position that I find myself in.
Once you realize how easy it is, it dawns on you just how hard it is. Yeah, that's a really, really compelling framing. It's funny that so I made the comment about scholasticism, and I just did that just to primarily to get Andrew riled up because I know that it will. But like that is there's some kind of some truth behind it though. But that's where really, if Augustine is where things started getting hairy, then it really took off in the direction you're talking about with somewhere between Anselm and Aquinas and the rise of scholasticism, and really correlated tightly with the birth of the printing press and the idea suddenly of ideas becoming something that are attached to books that the common man can read, that anybody can have access to these ideas, and therefore we need to have institutions that are responsible for parsing all the nitty-gritty details of these ideas. Like some of those the development of something like scholasticism you don't really get in a culture that primarily passes on knowledge through storytelling, because you don't have the need to approach a story like an 18th century German philosopher needing to parse and delineate everything to the nth degree. I mean, that's how the Bible was written. The Bible was written as a storybook. The Bible was not written as a history book. That doesn't mean that it's not telling a true history. That doesn't mean that it's not conveying truth about science or philosophy or history or any other number of things. But it wasn't written for that purpose. It was written as a story. It was written as a narrative describing God's interactions with his chosen people in reality and the experience that those people had with God. And them saying, if you want to have these same experiences, here's the thread to start pulling on. Start drawing on this. Align yourself with this way of being, and you'll start having the same experiences that we did. It's funny that you had the experience that you did, that you came at it the way you did, because I came from a pretty different perspective, but I wound up at a very similar spot. I got into Orthodox Christianity because I'd been raised Christian like you were, not Catholic, quite the opposite. I was raised like extreme Seventh-day Adventist, very devout anti-Catholic, but I was basically the same growing up. I had most of the Bible memorized just from actively memorizing verses, and just by default from reading it so much and spending so much time in the church and listening to it being read, but it was very hollow, and it had no life. And then there was just so much hypocrisy and stuff within the church that just didn't square for me, just didn't make sense. And I wanted it to make sense. And I started throughout my 20s, I was kind of drifting toward Eastern mysticism, and it wasn't from a desire for something mystical as much as it was, at least consciously, as much as it was wanting to understand reality. I wasn't looking to escape reality. I was looking to understand it. And I was realizing the deeper that I got into, anthropology led me into biology, led me into chemistry, led me into physics, led me into quantum mechanics. And as I was getting into quantum mechanics, I was like, all right, this is like maxing me out. Like I can barely keep this stuff in my head. I can't wrap my mind around it. But as I was listening to physicists describing quantum mechanics, I was like, these guys sound like Alan Watts. This sounds like Eastern mysticism, and Eastern mysticism is a whole world that I have no familiarity, no awareness of. I don't even know what they talk about. So I started going in that direction just to find out. It was actually Naval Ravikant was one big influence on me in that direction, because he would talk about like Krishnamurti and Osho and some of these guys, and a lot of what they said really resonated, especially a lot of the paradoxes and being comfortable with holding two opposing ideas in your mind and not having to throw out one in favor of the other, being able to just retain both of them and hold on to both of them. And a number of people kind of in a row all started talking to me about orthodoxy. And they were like, you might like orthodoxy based on some of the stuff you're talking about, because it's basically like Christianity, but mystical. And I was like, okay, so I'll go check it out. Just start listening to stuff about it. And that's one thing that you really start encountering a lot within orthodoxy, is there's a lot of paradoxes. It's and using scholasticism as an example, orthodoxy is not scholasticist, but that doesn't mean that it's not scholastic. There's lots of scholastics within orthodoxy. That was what some people get into it for, and like you said, you're drawn to like the practical simplicity of it, which it has. It is very practically simple. It's almost like it's simultaneously eternally simple and eternally complex, which is actually could be a pretty good way to describe God. So there's probably no coincidence there. But to me, the part that attracts me is the complexity of it, the depth and the color and the richness. And it's like, no matter how deep you dig, you're never going to reach the bottom. There's more to dig into. And those ideas, I don't think, stand in opposition to one another. It is just as simple and practically straightforward as you described it. It's also like eternally complex and nuanced and detailed, and there's depth to it that you can plumb for all eternity.
It's something interesting that that Vin Armani brought up on a conversation I believe he was having with Mark Clare and Pete Quinones a while back. That I really resonated with me because it was a very similar experience. You know, having gone through my Aleister Crowley, Golden Dawn, Kabbalah days, and having explored Sufism and, you know, whatever. I went through all of that, you know, just mostly academically, but some of it I thought was interesting to try in reality, but I never went super far. But having done ayahuasca and done hallucinogens numerous times, listening to Vin talk, he said he had a very similar experience, you know, and many of us have, listeners have, that if you were to mention something like that to kind of like a Catholic or a Protestant, the overwhelming response would be like, that didn't happen, right? That's neurons firing in your brain. That's made up. There's a logical explanation for this. Science has an explanation for this. Oh, the reason that you're all seeing the same trinome is because this neuron fires this way and this chemical glucose goes to this thing. And if you mention that very same, those very same experiences to an Orthodox priest, their initial response is generally, don't do that. Don't do that anymore. Right. So there's a home for that in Orthodox Christianity. And just to make this very clear for anyone listening, it's not like they developed that as a result of, you know, evaluating a particular situation and trying to come up with a response to it. It's always been there. It's always been there. And that is what I think is really interesting. It's not, they're not thinking through modern problems over the last 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years and developing answers for them. The answers come natural. It's sort of like if you're back in like libertarian brain, right? If somebody asks you, what do you think about taxation? Taxation is theft, right? It's just like, it's right there. But that comes from somewhere. Whereas the Orthodox Church, it's an eternal message that still has an answer for you. But a lot of the time, I think the questions that we ask of it, they're very modern Western questions that it isn't like they couldn't be answered, but the question itself and the point of asking a lot of questions is almost irrelevant to and almost a blind spot or a hindrance or roadblock to get you there. So what I often find when, and I love doing this because I'm a trivia freaking nerd, right? I've nerded out on Christianity for, 30 out of my 40 years. I just love the trivia part. And people will ask, what about this? What about this? What does Orthodox Christianity say about this? What does it say about that? And you can kind of answer those questions, but at the end of the day, it's like, but it doesn't ask those questions, right? It can provide you an answer, but most people would probably say, like, there's no reason to stress over these things. Like, why do you need an answer to this particular, irrelevant thing that you want to know? And it comes from this idea that I think that God is trying to punish you constantly for everything. Like whether or not this was actually taught to me in Catholic school, it's what I remember. So that's all that matters, right? And it's Adam and Eve were cast out of the garden for sinning. They're damned for eternity. You're damned for eternity. The best you can do is do all of these material things to try to earn your way back, to pay your penance and earn your way back so you go to heaven instead of going to hell. And it's a very unloving message for whatever reason. And, there's probably 40 hours of conversation to get into how this actually develops, which we could do over time. But
yeah, definitely.
That's what sort of the message is. And then you have somebody like Luther come along, and he takes that logical presupposition and then tries to figure out how, because he's like we don't have to get into a long conversation about Luther, a very tortured, neurotic individual, right? And he is basically killing himself trying to get into heaven. And then he goes, I don't have to do any of those things. It's just faith. It's just faith. Look, it says it right there. And then all of these like overwhelming, concerns of punishment are just gone, and he's liberated. However, that's not Christianity either. It's just curing your neuroses by finding a loophole. It's finding a loophole out of a completely illogical presupposition to begin with. It's sort of like if you somebody cuts their arm and it's like bleeding really bad, and you just take like a bunch of dirt and fungus and shove it in there to heal it. You're like, there, I healed it. And then, like, unbeknownst to you, 2 days later, that person dies. Right. And then you go on continuing to think that that's like a proper way to heal people, and then just keep killing them over and over and over and over and over again.
Because the Lutheran healing is like baked into the presupposition of it's just faith, is that deep down inside, you are irredeemably evil. You are irredeemably, eternally, permanently evil. And that the only thing that can be done for you is God papering over that and saying, technically you're still evil, but legally you're not evil anymore. But the psychological effects of retaining that in your subconscious, of retaining that knowledge that if it wasn't for the grace of God, if it wasn't for him, making a legal, just a legal exchange and putting a check mark in the right column, deep down inside, there's still this latent evil in me. I'm latently, fundamentally evil. There's so many theological concepts downstream from that are, it turns into, like what you described, an infection that is gonna rear its head again eventually down the road. When you have this baked in dialectic of I am evil, God is good, and something has to happen to change that. Something has to happen to change the fact that I am permanently, irredeemably evil and God is good, and I am set in opposition to him unless some legal mechanism can be derived that will change that reality. That Western dialectic mindset breeds so many, like, it starts from a simple misapprehension of reality, and then it breeds just like an infinite number of heresies and mental illnesses that could all be prevented with a simple perspective shift. And like you said, it's simple, but it's also massive at the same time. And that a way to conceptualize that is that the church is a hospital for sick people. The church is not a place of condemnation and finger wagging. That doesn't mean that there's no place for condemnation or finger wagging, but that's not what it's for. The church is a hospital for sick people to be healed, and that healing is possible. And that healing is not a legal technicality. That healing is real. That healing is completely real. This is what it's weird to me that orthodoxy is perceived as the mystical kind of woo-woo thing, because I'm like, this shit is more real than anything that I've ever encountered. This is like, orthodoxy isn't just like a set of ideas that you have. This is encountering reality in the most direct, tangible sense possible. It's like, if you think of like if you're trying to interact with a video game world and you have all these different heads-up displays and you keep trying on, you go like, I'll try this one. So you get this heads-up display and you're walking around with it, and everything's going well. You see a big grassy open meadow in front of you, and you're walking along in this grassy open meadow, and all of a sudden, clunk, you walk into something, and you're like, oh shit, this heads-up display didn't show me this gigantic tree right in front of me. Oh, this one's defective. Okay, let me find the next one. So, and what you're doing is there's a world outside of you, and there's your ability to perceive that world. And those two things aren't aligned. So you're trying to find the right heads-up display that will align perfectly with the world out around you. And that's what orthodoxy is. That's what the Orthodox Phronema is. It's you've put on the proper heads-up display that properly conveys to you the actual nature of the world that you exist in, of the world that you're walking around in and interacting with. So you're no longer experiencing the phenomenon of thinking there's a big, nice grassy meadow in front of you and walking right into a tree because your heads-up display didn't accurately convey that information to you. That's the most real thing possible, to actually engage with the world as it is. There's nothing that's like woo-woo or mystical about that. But again, talking about holding paradoxes together, it's also incredibly mystical and woo-woo, because the simple concept of a disparity between metaphysical reality and physical reality, that in and of itself is super woo-woo.
Well, I mean, yeah, right, because both and, but
right, yeah,
it does, Christianity does a couple of very unique things in human history, and it, unlike basically every other religion, which either and mostly is about escaping this body in this world, or in a couple maybe like Islam is really about like God tells you to do something, you must do it, and then you can escape this world. So it's really all about getting out of here. And even and maybe this is why Roman Catholicism was so prone to that idea, because it was, the Western Roman Empire was essentially being invaded by people who thought like that. And so I think that infuses itself into Western Christianity, where it doesn't adopt paganism, but it does adopt this sort of idea that ultimately the idea is to escape this world. Now, they're not going to say it that way, but every indication leads you when you watch the behavior and you look at the doctrine, and then you even look at the reaction to the doctrine, even the evangelical doctrines or Calvinist doctrines, right? It really ultimately is about getting out of here, getting to heaven as quick as possible, the easiest way possible, to the point where, do you accept Jesus Christ as your personal Lord and Savior, as your golden ticket straight to heaven, no matter what, right? This is the easiest way to get the hell out of this place. And Orthodox Christianity, as far as I can tell, is incredibly unique in, like you said, in describing reality, but also appreciating your place in it. That, if this is the story that you believe, it's a very specific story. You're here on this earth for a reason. You were always supposed to be on this earth for a reason. It's a different reason now, but you were always supposed to be a steward of Earth, of the planet, of the universe, whatever you want to call it. And that was always the plan. And it's not about escaping here. It's about coming back into the order that you were created for in the first place. And I don't know how that message could not basically resonate with anyone. I mean, there's going to be a huge blind spot because they're going to hear Christian, 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 and there's just that natural like reaction to that. But none of this even conflicts with like modern science and or any science, pre-modern science, modern science, or whatever the hell science is going to be 2,000 years from now if we make it that far. And it brings to mind a conversation I was having with someone in my extended family, and they're Protestant, pretty actively so, super super good people, right? That totally on the right path, but just haven't had all the information presented like many of us. And he was talking about, you know, being swayed over to the idea that the Earth is 6,000 years old, and basing this on the Book of Genesis. And I didn't, out of, I guess, a little bit out of sort of taking care of myself to the point where I didn't want to get into it. And then also realizing family was around, not wanting to like co-opt the conversation. I didn't really bring this up until later and kind of talked about it in private. But my initial thoughts that I'll share with you and the listeners, if that's what you're pulling out of that story, you need to either not read that story anymore because it's not for you, or you need to go back and reread that story again. And I'll qualify that by saying everybody who you ever talk to who's a Christian, especially if they're very like a theologian, which I'm not, or like an amateur theologian, which I sometimes claim to be, and they'll always tell you about the true Christianity. It's, oh, this is this way and every other one is wrong. If you're reading the book of Genesis and what you take out of it isn't that this is a story that is being told by people who are, we believe, inspired by the Holy Spirit, who are being communicated to by God in a way that they can conceptualize in that moment, right? Because even believing now that the earth is round and the universe is vast, there's other planets in the solar system, and the sun is made out of it's a thermonuclear reactor. 2,000 years from now, people might look back and be like, man, those people in 2022, they thought the earth was round. They didn't know it was hexagonal, you know, or whatever. Or now we have time travel. And it's like, none of that matters. What was being communicated to these people, you know, 4,000, 5,000 years ago was in a language they understood. So they were able to communicate it. They were explaining it the best way they could, that there's an order to the universe. Human beings are misaligned from that order. And here is a manual about how to get back into that order. And that's basically it. The entire Bible, I mean, to really distill it down, is a manual on what not to do and what to do if you want to get back into order. And that was very simply kind of what I got when I was like 13 years old. It's like, this seems really simple. As sometimes historical, sometimes allegorical, sometimes metaphorical, sometimes very literal, but like not one of those things the whole time. That there's and when you, I've had a little bit of pushback when I talk to some people online about this, and they're like, well, I don't need a story, I need a reality. And I'm like, no, it's like human beings communicating the best they can to describe the actual reality. We don't know how to describe God or reality. We don't try to do that. Like, that's what Aquinas did, right? We don't need to prove everything or explain everything. It's like, this is the best way, you know, where Jesus talks in parables. He's talking to fishermen, so he uses fish parables. Or he's talking to farmers, so he uses farmer parables. Like, this is Abraham, this is Isaac, this is Jacob. Or somebody would be like, you know, why does Abraham pimp his wife out like so many times? Well, like, because he's human and he makes mistakes, right? Like, the point of the story is not that Abraham is like, you know, the icon to follow. The point is, he's a human being, he makes mistakes, and we can learn from those mistakes if we read the story in order to learn something from it, rather than to completely judge everybody, which is exactly what you're not supposed to do. So, like, I hope that people can like maybe go back and just pick these books up and sort of read them from that point of view. And it's going to be very difficult because a lot of times when you're hearing Protestant preachers or Catholic homilies or sermons, they don't make those connections, right? Or they do, but they, you know, they update it a little bit too much, or they make it too palatable. Or I even heard one say that the parable of the loaves and the fishes, or the story of the loaves and the fishes, was really just a way of saying everybody had their own loaves and fishes, and they were hiding them to be selfish, and then they decided to share them because Jesus was being so kind. And I'm like, come on, dude. Like, you can pull something out of that, but that's not it. right? And so there is a truth to these stories. They are true, but did God literally create the world in 7 American calendar days, like of 24 hours each in a calendar that was never thought of, it existed? That's silly, right? Like, it's silly. But is it true? Yeah, of course it's true. So people say, well, how could it be true and not literal? And it's like, well, this is the phronema that you talk about. This is the different mindset. You have to break yourself of it's got to be this or that, right? It's got to be this or that in the Western world. I don't have an answer. I have to prove it. I have to have an answer. I have to synthesize these two things together to come up with it. I have to have an answer. And it's like, there's an answer, but it requires you to break yourself of this mindset. And if you haven't lived through the last 2 years and you don't want to figure out how to break the mindset that you see around you, you are ultimately incredibly dangerous to yourself and to others. So I'll let that float for a minute and see what you think.
That idea that these things are the Bible in particular is true, and it's also a story written from the perspective. It's a true story written from a specific perspective. And to read it as a factual, detailed, scientific manual is to misread it. That's actually not. Let me put it this way. The things that we read as factual, scientific, detailed manuals are themselves just stories. They're not actually factual scientific manuals. And we have deceived ourselves into believing that they are because of our excessive faith in human reason. This is a lot of this very scholastic Western approach to reading scripture and approaching scriptural stories is a product of a belief in the perfection of human rationale, and that I need the answers, I need the actual exact details, as if that's possible, as if it's possible to access and be able to document and prove that these are the exact details of this historical narrative that happened however long ago. There's this hubris that we have that will be like, well, I know the story of Napoleon because I went and I read it. Okay, so you read the exact things that happened? Well, of course you didn't. It's not possible to read the exact events as they happened. What you read was a collection of perspectives, and you're using that collection of perspectives to try to triangulate what the actual truth was. But the actual truth is lost. You'll never be able to access it. This is a reality of history. And I remember encountering this back, before I really started just mainlining red pills. The belief that you should distrust anybody who claims to be an objective source. Anybody who says, I have the objective truth about this event, is either trying to deceive you or trying to deceive themselves, or both. Because there's no such thing as an objective retelling of an event. This is the purpose of juries. We're going to use this collection of people, and we're going to bring this collection of different witnesses, and we're going to compare them all to each other and try to deduce the truth, knowing that there's a margin for error because we're never going to actually be able to uncover it. This is just the way that human stories have always been. It's just that the Western scholastic tradition in particular has created this impression of a specific category of truth that is like, if we've written something down and enough experts have sanctioned it, then it's actually factual. And this is actually a there's like this weird spiritual dynamic to it, where it's like, because enough people have sanctioned this, it has achieved a next level of truth. We've ascended to another plane of truth that enough of the sanctioned priesthood have said this book is true and accurate. Therefore, you should take every single thing here as a factual retelling of exact events. That's just it's not reality. That doesn't mean it's categorically not the exact factual
Mm-hmm.
retelling. But if you're focused on it in that way, you're looking at it from the wrong perspective. You're inhabiting a hubristic posture, whether toward yourself or toward the capability of humanity in general, that humanity is somehow able to capture and convey absolute objective truth through a subjective lens. That just has never been possible for humans. And it's really clear and obvious that that's the case when you have people just telling stories, like sitting around the campfire telling stories. It's like you take everything with a grain of salt, because it's like,
Mm-hmm.
is it factual? Probably not. Is it true? Yeah. But for some reason, when you start writing it into books, and then you start having people at pretentious universities putting their stamp of approval on the thing, suddenly it ascends to a new metaphysical plane of truth. And and then, like you outlined, downstream from there, you get all kinds of issues, because now people have lost sight of what true actually means.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, even just like last night. I mean, thinking about last night, right now, right an hour ago, I was talking to my girlfriend. We had two completely different ideas of an incident that happened last night, and
Mm-hmm.
from both of our perspectives, like once we kind of talked about it for a minute, it was like, okay, well, all right, I get now why you saw it that way. Nothing bad, whatever, but just even that, in very colloquial, kind of anecdotal instance. Or I think about, some of the books behind me. There's a top shelf that has some JFK stuff on it. My father was a big JFK conspiracy nut. And I don't have
My
all the
type of
books.
guy.
I don't know where they all went, but there was like 15 to 20 books. And every one of them has a completely different theory, even if they kind of agree with each other in some aspects. Not every single instance, well, Oswald did this, but he wasn't there this day, but he was there this day. And this person saw this from the grassy knoll or whatever. That if, and it's been said, and you'll know where it was said, that if everybody agreed, then you would know it was made up.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, I was having a conversation with a buddy of mine that I kind of grew up with and worked with me for a while in the restaurant industry on Facebook randomly, maybe like a month and a half ago. One of the rare times I posted on Facebook, and he'd never heard of Bart Ehrman, but I kind of mentioned Bart Ehrman in the middle of the conversation, and people can Google the guy, Ehrman, Ehrman, I believe. I said, "Oh, you sound like Bart Ehrman. I could do this all day, but it's boring." And then he obviously, when he like Googled Bart Ehrman and he came back and he was like, "Yeah, I like that guy." And he was like, thought it was a positive comment, but it was one of those like, "Oh, Adam, this is a big gotcha, right? There was more than four gospels, right? That dumb argument or whatever, because a bunch of them were written a century later." And like, also the four gospels don't agree. They have totally different, not totally different, but like there's different aspects of each one, because each writer is talking to a particular audience for a particular reason. And then a lot of people will say like the synoptic gospels versus John, like, why does John leave all this stuff out? There's reasons for that too. He may have had access to them and was kind of filling in the gaps. He was also much younger than the other apostles. But the point being, if they all agreed exactly, then you would think that they got together and conspired. Like the same people who are saying they're untrue right now because they're different would be this very same people with the same presupposition saying, well, they're all untrue because they agree with
Absolutely.
each other. Because people like Bart Ehrman or these people, they've already decided that they're not going to believe this. And far be it for me to judge somebody who was born Anglican and grew up evangelical to become who he was. I guess I don't really blame him for that. It's probably like the worst combination of things that could drive you to insanity. But if you're coming to a situation and you're saying, well, there's no way this is possibly true, then you're the carpenter with the hammer looking for a nail everywhere, right? But then people will quote him like that's the true guy. That's the guy because they don't want it, if they don't want it to be true either. So like, obviously I think Christians come at it with the presupposition that it is true. But if you come at it with the presupposition that it's literally true, then you're also going to get yourself, basically what you're going to do is double down on that guy, that Bart Ehrman character or folks like him, and you're going to be answering the wrong questions. And this is
Yes.
sort of the decline from like Luther to Zwingli, Calvin, Butzer all the way, Bollinger all the way down the line of through the, the Puritans and Anglican Reformation, and then to the Puritans to here to deism. It's just a constant doubling down on these poor presuppositions. And so like the worst way to respond to somebody with someone like Bart Ehrman is for, an evangelical Christian conservative to be like, no, actually, I can prove that this happened because archaeological evidence. And like, no, no, because then you're giving that person's argument, you're validating that person's illogical presupposition by even debating him in the first place. And so that's why I'd much rather come on and talk to folks like you. And the aha moment for me with this was when I was talking to Jacob Daniel 3 from Twitter. I was on his show. I love it, dude. Dude's great and really good debater, very knowledgeable about his stuff. I find Protestants generally are knowledgeable for the most part. Like they can pick out verses, they know the Bible really well. I love that because it saves me a lot of time. There was a moment where it just clicked about 80% of the way through the interview, and I went, we are not talking about the same thing. I'm talking about something completely different than he's talking about.
I remember exactly that point. I remember listening to it and hearing that.
And I think Tommy even like put a meme in the group chat, and he was like a snapshot of my face, and he was like, here's the moment where Adam realized that because we'd been talking for like an hour and a half, and I went in my head, I went, oh, we just wasted an hour and a half. We just totally I didn't even realize it. I was just assuming we were on the same page. And then I went, and then he asked me to talk again. And I really do want to talk. I really do like the guy. And like I said, he's very knowledgeable, but I don't know what anyone would get out of that, because we would constantly be not having the same conversation. And I think I would get it, but I don't know if he would get it. And that's just like no knock on him.
Just as an aside, he has changed a bit over the last several months. He's
okay.
It might be an interesting conversation to revisit, given some of his, I'll just say, I don't want to air him out too much, but I've just been kind of aware of some of his sympathies as he's kind of progressing and updating the way he thinks about things. But
fair enough. And just to say, if he's listening, it's more being respectful of his time than it is me thinking I'm wasting my time. Like I just don't want to drag the kid on for an hour and a half again, and then, like do him a disservice. So that's kind of what I'm getting at.
Remind me what it was that you, just to kind of put some skin on it, what it was that you realized when you realized you guys were talking past each other. I don't remember the exact details of it.
I don't remember it either. And I won't.
It was something about libertarianism and Christianity. And
I think it had something to do with our kind of point is that like libertarianism is Christianity without Christ, or really anything from the liberal modernist scholastic tradition even is Christianity without Christ. And so I think what clicked for me is he was saying, no, libertarianism and Christianity are like beautifully aligned. And I was like, no, they're complete polar. Like they couldn't be more opposed. And then I went, because he's not talking about the same Christianity I'm talking about.
Yeah.
That Christianity that he's talking about is perfectly aligned with libertarianism, perfectly aligned. And that was where I went, we're not having the same conversation.
Yes, that's right. I remember that. Yeah. Cause there's a thing called the word concept fallacy, where just because we're both talking about, I've mentioned before, mouth sounds and mind pictures. And just because we're using the same mouth sound doesn't mean we have the same mind picture. And just because we're both calling the thing Christianity doesn't mean that we have the same thing inside our heads that we're actually referring to. Libertarianism, being part of the liberal school, is like, you can trace its genealogy, that it was born out of the scholastic tradition that came from I can see the like the tree, the generational tree in my head, where you have the Great Schism, and really the East and the West separate. And from there on, they, with some exceptions, they largely don't talk to each other. The East goes about doing their thing and the West goes about doing their thing. And after that schism, the East more or less remained a functionally cohesive whole. There was no major, was and still hasn't been any major schism over like no major point where it departed to where we're now living in different realities. But the West has schismed like hundreds or thousands of times over since then.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And each of these little splinter groups is now living in their own little separate reality. And downstream from that, way down here is libertarianism, which is a descendant of those earlier traditions. You would never get libertarianism in the East.
Right.
It would have never arisen in the East.
Right.
It's functionally and incontrovertibly a child of the Western scholastic tradition, because it was born from people who grew up in the world that was created by with the same fundamental presuppositions as those earlier traditions. So you can't separate an idea from its parents. They go together. And you can't understand them you can't understand the idea without understanding its parents. You can't understand the parents without understanding the children, the ideas that are born out of them, because they each give you, we're talking about the limited subjective frame of a human being. And like, you're trying to accumulate as many perspectives as you possibly can. This is why a jury is made up of 12 people and not 2. It's because we just picked a number. We couldn't have 5,000, so we'll pick a number, but it's because we want to try to get as many different perspectives as possible. So if you're trying to evaluate an idea, you want as many perspectives on that as you can get. And the parents and the children of an idea will give you a different angle or different perspective at that idea and help you understand it better.
I was talking to a local Orthodox priest around this area here, and I asked him why Augustine is canonized in Orthodox Christianity, and he gave me an answer, which I'm going to tell you, but rather than just repeat it without checking it out, I just kind of asked a few other people and kind of went on the internet a little bit too, and it seems to be generally agreed upon that he was sort of canonized just kind of the West did it. And what I learned, in which you may already know, Augustine spoke Latin. He didn't speak Greek. The East mainly spoke Greek. They didn't read Latin. So they didn't ever really know of each other. And we're only talking 400 years, after the death of Christ. So it's not like 2,000 years later. There's already that huge disconnect between the East and the West that they don't even know what the other ones are writing. And, and this priest said to me that he thinks over time the Orthodox Church will decanonize Augustine. He thinks when they start reading more and more of his books and they start becoming more kind of studied by the bishops and the patriarchs. Well, I guess patriarchs is the right word. That he thinks he'll be decanonized, because it ends up being such a destructive. It's not like Augustine didn't contribute good things, but the stuff that really got the 3 or 4 things out of the thousands that he came up with are the 3 or 4 things that essentially created Western Christianity, and then all of the reactions to it. So the 2 things I was thinking about there, the idea of individualism, which is essentially the cornerstone of Western civilization, is not a concept in Eastern Phronema, right? In individualism, there are individuals who have individual goals and responsibilities, but essentially it's a very communal kind of way of thinking. And again, for the listeners, it's not like we say East and West, there's a vertical line that runs through the earth and everybody on this side is Western and everybody on this side it's like a more of an Eastern way of thinking, more of a Western way of thinking that developed over time through, various socio-political, economic, religious invasions by the Turks. Certain things just happen that sort of make this happen. But that idea of individualism doesn't drive their culture. And so the culture is completely different. Now, many people may like the idea of living in an individualistic culture where they kind of get to do whatever they want as long as they don't hurt other people and take their stuff. I would just posit, anyone go back and listen to any episode of King Pill that you've ever put out, or any episode of You're Talking Over Me. I think there's 83 of them. Or having just had any one of your 5 senses functioning over the last 24 months to come to a conclusion that maybe rabid individualism is not particularly the way forward if you want to have a peaceful, cohesive society, but to each their own.
Right. Drag Queen Story Hour and trannies doing lap dances on kids is a product of individualism. And an adherent to individualism has no coherent opposition to that type of thing. It's and as you said, it's you don't see that type of thing in the East, and that's largely because, by and large, and I want to make it clear that we're not saying that everything from the West is bad and everything from the East is good. We're
Mm-hmm.
speaking in broad strokes here, but the East doesn't fall into these dialectical traps the way that the West does, which is partly because the East is much more comfortable. This is something that's true with Eastern, just Eastern cultures in general, not just Eastern Christianity, but Eastern cultures in general are much more comfortable with paradox and being able to just accept two conflicting notions without having to reduce things down beyond a certain point. I mean, within the West, you get things like with communion, they start reducing it to, okay, it's bread and wine until this exact moment when the priest says these exact words, and then it becomes the body and blood of Christ. The East doesn't do that because it's you can't reduce things down to the atomic level like that and still maintain a coherent frame. There isn't a specific moment where it becomes the body and blood of Christ and it wasn't before, because those individual moments don't exist alone. You never get that individual moment standing in isolation. It's always connected to the moment before and the moment after. Just the same with a human being. You never get an individual, isolated, atomized person. No person. The very idea of an identity, shout out LB Muniz, the very concept of an identity presumes a community. Because a single isolated atomized person would have no identity. There's no purpose. The purpose of an identity is to identify you either connected to or distinct from other people. So the notion of having to parse between individualism versus collectivism, this is a false dichotomy. There's no such thing as collectivism or individualism. They don't actually exist. What you have are communities of people that worship a god or worship many gods. And the question is, what God is your community going to worship? And how is that going to be revealed in the individuals who are a part of that community? Because you become what you worship. Whatever it is, you're going to become that. It's going to be borne out in your personality, the way you act, your behavior, all of these things. You don't exist as an isolated, atomized person. And trying to build a legal system or a culture on something that doesn't exist is just going to give you a gigantic performative lie, which is essentially what Western society has become.
Yeah, I mean, you are what you do, right? So if if I want to become a computer programmer, I practice computer programming, and eventually I become a really good computer programmer. Right? Maybe it's in me naturally, or maybe I have a jump start. But you do become the things that you constantly do. We all use ritual in order to become something. A lot of us do it without thinking about it. But I think what we're kind of trying to move the paradigm to is you can actually choose other rituals over the ones you're doing now, and they will actually lead you to a more positive outcome in life. Like that emptiness, that God-shaped hole that people were trying to jam materialism into, or even materialisticism into, or just materials if they're weird, like there's a way you were actually programmed. There's a way you were actually programmed where there's something very specific that's supposed to be in there, right? It isn't really an option, and everything else you do is going to leave you feeling incomplete. And a friend of ours was visiting me this past weekend.
Shout out to that friend.
Should we just say? Is that fair?
I think we probably can, yeah.
Okay, so Rachel came up to visit on her way back from Pork Fest, and she was talking about like Islam and Judaism and Buddhism and the various aspects of Hinduism and all these other like global religions, huge religions and stuff. And she said, is there a place for this, do you think, in people who are those things or identify as or are part of those religious communities? Obviously they're probably quote unquote better off than somebody worshiping Walmart. I mean, I would think so. But how would I equate the two? How would I look at it? And I said, I think there many religions are kind of like tuned into something similar, but it's a corrupted or incomplete version of it. So they won't get this certain sense of belonging to natural order the way that you will in this particular aspect. There may be better aspects of certain things than others, or different ways of looking at the universe. And, I think even like paganism or demonic worship or Ouija boards is a way of tapping into something. It's all real. It's just a matter of, is it 100% evil, or is it just an incomplete way to try to escape the world? I thought that was really interesting. But I was thinking, when you were talking about identity, just to date myself a little bit, I was thinking about the late 90s, and like everybody was, a rebel and trying to be themselves and different from everybody else. But really, you were like a BMXer, a skater, an Abercrombie guy. Like you always fell into a group, a community. I can't think of one person I've ever met in my life who was like so rabidly individualist that I couldn't think of another person who was just like them. That unique. I mean, Christ, I've never met him, but any human being living in the world that's so unique, you can't be like, oh yeah, I've seen a version of that somewhere. So that's I think that's kind of interesting. Thoughts on the incompletion of other religions, or whether or not they might be on a similar journey, but not quite.
Even the people who would be like, eventually you get the people who are like so individualistic, they're so unique and so special that they all look the same. The ones who try to be, there's something about shout out to Jason with the 2-Bit podcast. He'd love this. There's a Girardian mimetic thing there where we all become what we desire, and we desire things based on what we see other people desiring. So there's this natural mimetic instinct in all of us where we just naturally, we don't know what to do with ourselves. We don't know how to behave. You see this with babies. Babies naturally just mimic what they see with other people. And it just becomes that tendency continues. It persists throughout the life of a person. Like, people naturally just mimic the people who have the life that they want to have. They just look at them and they're like, well, okay, that person there, they have all the things that I want. So we have this natural instinct that, like, well, okay, if I start acting like that person, then I'll get the things that they have that I want. We're naturally wired or programmed that way. Mm-hmm. So even the kids, you'd have the kids that were like, oh, well, I don't fit in with anybody. I'm the complete outcast that has nothing in common with any of you guys. And all those kids would all look the same. They would all look and dress and act the same. Mm-hmm. It's like, well, okay, you're now embodying the archetype of the loner outcast. Even the loner outcasts all look the same. They all have the same general characteristics. The question of about the other religions, this is kind of funny because I was going for a walk this morning with Amy and Eastwood, and we were talking about schools and talking about, that's how much I want to say here. We were talking about the prospect of taking over school districts and being able to take control of school districts at the local level and have like mandate Christian curriculum, like mandating curriculum for teaching like a Christian worldview and Austrian economics at the local level, and how that would work and that sort of thing. And she was like, well, what about, what if you want to have like what if Jews want to have, schools for Judaism, or Muslims want to have schools for Muslims? And I was like, they're welcome to send their kids to the Christian school, or they can go get their own town and they can take over that town and they can have their schools there. But in a Christian town, we're going to have Christian schools and we're going to teach our kids Christian values. And that's how it's going to be. And if you take the Orthodox telling of reality as at face value, each of these other religions is quite literally built around the worship of demons that have like actual entities that are accepting human worship because they've departed from their duty, from their responsibility to the Most High God. And they've begun accepting worship that's naturally intended for him for themselves. And I suppose the ones that have persisted the longest, that seem the most, there's something to the idea of lendiness, that stuff that has lasted for a long time will last for a long time. And something that's lasted for a long time necessarily must be close to the truth, because things that are super far removed from the truth, just by definition, don't last. So the religions that have been around for the longest time, I think, they must necessarily have more truth to them than the ones that don't. At the same time, the most deceptive lies are the ones that are 99% truth.
Mm-hmm.
I tweeted something about this recently, or I said that that good is 100% good and evil is 99% good.
Mm.
And so I don't know. I guess I don't have a direct answer for you, which is probably because I'm uncomfortable, because I kind of know what the answer should be, and I'm probably uncomfortable saying it.
Well, I mean, evil's been around, a couple seconds. God's been around a couple seconds longer than evil, right? So, I mean, you're right. Just because something is, let's say, completely demonic, doesn't make it any less true. It just makes it terrible. So I think that's, when we look at like the ultimate goal of religion, or the ultimate goal of even secular humanism, really like what its ultimate goals are, they're not ultimately happy ones. And we don't really need to get like giddy about what the word happy means. Like, you kind of know when you're complete as a human being and when you're incomplete. And so, yeah, I think, maybe that's a good place to kind of hold on. I don't want to like bother our Buddhist friends or our
right. I'll say this: I have a direction we can take this. It ties in. We were talking earlier about the kind of the product of Luther's kind of the latent presuppositions in Luther's sola fide doctrine that are which is that basically humanity is irredeemably evil. That humanity at its core is fundamentally evil. You even have this borne out in Calvinism's doctrine of total depravity, where they actually make this, they formalize this in a doctrine. And there are massive theological issues with this, because what this is really born out of is okay. I need to back up even further. So I get all these thoughts that all connect themselves at once. So there's this notion that Eastern Christianity is like, ooh, it's all the woo-woo mystical stuff where everyone just kind of sits around and goes USA and stuff. And then in the West, everything is very rigorous and academic. And it's couldn't be further from the truth. Because if you go read the church fathers, if you go read the Cappadocian fathers, or you go read Gregory Palamas, like these are rigorous philosophers. These are not like lazy woo-woo thinkers. So there's the concept of a nature and a concept of a person, and these are distinct things. I think it was St. John of Damascus, I think, who said that every heresy is born from confusing or not making the proper distinction between nature and person. So we as human beings, we have a nature. We share in a common nature of being human, but we are separate persons. We are separate expressions of that nature. Our personhood and our nature are distinct facets of who we are. We share nature, a nature. We share human nature, but we don't share personhood. I have my personhood. You have your personhood. The notion of total depravity confuses person and nature, because for something to be evil in its nature, there's only two things that are possible. Either God created something that is fundamentally evil in its nature, or God changed something into something that was good into something evil in its nature. Because natures don't change by definition. By definition, the nature of a thing is the thing that is that thing. It's the thingness of that thing. So to say that humanity when humanity fell, somehow we became irredeemably evil in our nature. I guess not technically irredeemably, that wouldn't be fair to them. We became completely and totally evil in our nature is to presume one of those two things. Either way, you're accusing God of creating evil. And God did not create evil because everything God created was good. In fact, he said that. He said that at the end of the creation account. He beheld everything that he created and he said it's all good. Everything that exists is good because evil does not exist. Evil does not have ontological status. Evil does not have existence. Evil is a negation of the good. Evil is the absence of the good. So our persons can choose evil, but that does not make us evil in our nature. Our nature is still fundamentally good because our nature was created by God. And this is a difficult truth to reckon with, to wrestle with because of some of the implications. But ultimately, to me, it's like the thing you said earlier, where it's very simple, but it's also really complex, but it's very freeing once you realize the actual implications of it, that human nature is fundamentally good. And the church is a hospital for sick people. The idea of a hospital is that healing is possible. So if we were fundamentally evil, then there's no point in a hospital for fundamentally evil. It just doesn't make sense. It only makes sense if it's possible to be healed. And it is possible to be healed. You can go to the hospital for healing, and you can partake in the prescription for healing. And this completely blows the faith versus works dichotomy out of the water.
Right.
Because you don't go do these things because the works are what are going to save you. You go do these things because doing these things heals you. Mm-hmm. It's like you take the medicine because the medicine is going to heal you. You don't take the medicine because there's some sort of salvific ontological quality to the action of taking it that will heal you. It's because the medicine goes into your body and helps your body heal itself. This is the same thing with works. The so-called works are the things that you do because the very literal act of doing them heals your actual self.
Right.
This is like orthodoxy is so grounded and down to earth and real. There's nothing mystical about it at all. And yet it's completely mystical.
Yeah, and lest people think that we're showing them like a third option here. We won't do it on this show because it'll take too long, but I will eventually, when I listen back to this later, and you may do it as well, start building on kind of where I want to go based on our conversation here. And there's a pretty strong argument, and I'll say it's 100%, but pretty strong argument that this has pretty much always been the message, and that the people who diverted from this path are Rome and the Protestant Revolution, doubling down on really bad presuppositions from Rome, and Augustine, and maybe some other folks right around that era.
By the way, I love Protestant Revolution. I love that framing.
that they just went in a completely different direction. So I think what you would get from them, they would tell you they've evolved their thought, right? The Catholic Church, of course, reason is part of the Catholic Church. It's not part of the Eastern Orthodox Church. Now, it's not like they don't use reason and logic, but it's not canon. Where in the Roman Catholic Church, the idea of reason and enlightenment and thought and rationalizing through things is part of canon. So it's built in to their system, but it wasn't from the get-go. So they would probably say this is this is not necessarily like a miscalculation on our part to say this. They would probably say, no, that's part of it, is we grow and we think and we rationalize and we work through these things together. And then the Protestant people did the same thing. They're working through things and rationalizing. So I imagine that some of them might look back at, Eastern Orthodoxy and be like, well, they just haven't figured this stuff out yet. They're just way back there, and eventually they'll come to these same logical conclusions. And it's like, well, but if you follow the consequences of your logical conclusions, like the difference between where you are in modern America and where you are in the Eastern Orthodox Church, existing right down the road from you currently in modern America, are so completely different that you go, okay, well, they're not reconcilable, right? There's no way like the Orthodox Church is going to come into communion with the Catholic Church, and they don't even really think Protestants are really Christians. So like, it's not that we're damning anybody. I mean, for all I know, Billy Graham's going to go to heaven before, you know, the Patriarch of Constantinople. Like, who knows? We don't know, right? But okay, so you look at that total polar opposite thing going on, and you go, well, which one of those things fits reality, order, and actually heals me? And one of them does, and one of them doesn't. Right? That's me doing a little Hegelian dialectic here for everybody, right? One of those things does this, and the other thing doesn't do this. So if you want to just put it into practice, go do one, then go do the other, and come back and tell me which one doesn't make you necessarily feel better, but when you really allow it to like absorb into your body through osmosis, and your soul and your mind and your, you know, the noose as well. That's not, by the way, for listeners, a thing found in that like NASCAR driver's garage. It's totally different. It's like part of the soul and the mind. The noose.
I was going to mention that when you were talking about reason within Catholicism, because Orthodoxy doesn't have a doctrine of reason, which is kind of, because like if you asked an Orthodox person, well, do you have that like dogmatized? It'd be kind of like, no, like why would we? That'd be kind of silly to treat it that way. But by the same token, the West doesn't have the concept of the noose. It doesn't exist anywhere in the West, which is partly why the idea of the Phronema is kind of difficult to convey to a Western mind as well, because the Phronema and the noose are very closely intertwined. Because having or developing or being gifted the Orthodox Phronema is part and parcel with the cleansing and the development of your noose. The idea with the noose, for just quick and dirty, is that there is a part of your the Orthodox. I mean, the translation, the closest thing would be mind, but that has all sorts of baggage with it in the West now that there isn't a word to accurately convey it. But it's something like the part of your psyche that is optimized for speaking with God. That there is part of your mind that is optimized for being directly connected to God, and for God to connect and speak to you, and you to speak to him. And that is the noose. And the noose gets clouded and corrupted and calcified and ossified. And, there's a lot of kind of, there's tie-ins, there's connections to the pineal gland. There's like, if you look at like Eastern paganism, there's a lot of the stuff with the pineal gland. There's some overlap with the Orthodox conception of the noose, but the Orthodox conception of the noose isn't as like, it's not like an actual organ of your body. It's a like a spiritual concept, but it's a very real thing that each of us has a noose, and there's specific activities and behaviors and stuff that you can take or you can participate in that will degrade and corrupt your noose, and will cut you off or disable you from being able to really functionally connect with and commune with God. And so all of the so-called works are directed at prayer and fasting and almsgiving and receiving the Eucharist and all of these sorts of things. They're not things that you do because God is wagging his finger at you, and if you don't do them, then you're damned. It's that this is how you are saved. Like, this is the mechanism whereby, if you want to reduce it to a mechanism, these are the things you do because they're good for you, because they heal you, because they optimize you, they tune you into being able to connect to the right wavelength to be able to directly commune with God. You have to participate in these types of behaviors, because if you don't, then it's like, if you don't run wind sprints, then you won't be able to run wind sprints. It's just kind of like, it's not that running wind sprints somehow makes you spiritually deserve to be able to run wind sprints. It's that the fact that you ran wind sprints means that you optimized your body and your mind to have the endurance and the capability to run wind sprints. It's the same type of concept with the so-called works within Orthodoxy.
And to just throw a bone to our Protestant friends, what Luther's seeing, of course, is the same thing that Christ saw with the Pharisees, right? Well, it's actually not quite the same thing, but it's the same idea. There are people who, so the Pharisees are doing the law. They're like living to the very code of the law, but not in their hearts or in their souls. Right. They're just doing the action. And what, in contrast, or sort of in communion, what Luther is seeing in the early 1500s is the Catholic Church not even doing that. Like, they're not even putting on airs or following the law. They're in positions of control, essentially ruling over the world and condemning people. And they're buying and selling political offices. They're buying and selling indulgences. So from his particular literal mindset, coming from the neurotic place that he's in, and he's torturing himself for his first, 30 years of his life, he looks at these people and he's like, well, that's why works don't matter, because look at all these things they're saying. And they're, so obviously that's not true. But rather than go back and realize, that, yes, you're right, the Roman Catholic Church is very much corrupt, and they're embedding in the government, and they're doing all of these evil, horrific things to people, and, messing with your eternal soul. Really, it's incredibly dangerous. Rather than go back and see where he should have gone with that, it was a reaction. So I just pulled this up real quick so folks could see. So Nous, Nous, and I had typed up earlier something just in case this came up. The highest faculty in man, through which, provided it is purified, he knows God or the inner essences or principles, and can be defined as the eye of the heart or soul, or the mind of the heart. So it's, yes, very hard to like literally translate into English, but definitely definitely a quote unquote spiritual organ that we don't that we need to really work hard to get some wind sprints out of. So maybe we could, unless you want to you have a couple topics that you wanted to bring up. I had something I kind of wanted to make sure we fit in here before we ended. Was there any particular topic on your mind that we didn't touch before I kind of ask you this question?
I don't think so. No.
Okay. So here is something I've been playing around with in my head a lot. So until about, let's say, right before World War I, when the East is basically kind of liberated from Ottoman Turkish rule, and they're able to actually, rather than hand copy every Bible or liturgy book that they have, now they have access to the printing press. And now, like, all of a sudden, 100 years later, starting probably about 10 years ago, Orthodoxy is now being communicated, even by you and I, to a Western audience, and hopefully marginally well. Do you think that what the Eastern Orthodoxy will help heal the West, or do you think the West, and by this I mean the Western Phronema, that the West will end up infecting Eastern Orthodoxy, taking it over and destroying it? Or do you think maybe somewhere in the middle? Do you think that Orthodox Christianity has a chance of actually reaching people to the point where it changes Christendom, it changes the culture? Or do you think it will end up being infected to the point where it ends up the same way Catholicism did?
It's a good question. I've been wrestling with something a lot along these lines for the last several months, and it's partly why I haven't really been kind of talking a lot about this stuff in public, because number one, I'm reticent for people to see me as an authority on orthodoxy, and someone who speaks for the church or anything like that, which, I mean, over the last hour and a half, we've spoken very authoritatively on a lot of this stuff. So I realized that could come off as, I don't know, trying to have my cake and eat it too, or something like that. And I have this instinct that when I start to understand something, I'm like, I get it now. I'm the foremost authority on this. I want everybody else to see it the way I do.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm recognizing that instinct in myself. And so I'm I have to catch myself because I would love to go off on a lot of this stuff and really try to paint myself as the authority publicly. And I'm actively trying to countervail that instinct. At the same time, I came from a tradition that is very eschatologically, not scatologically, eschatologically obsessed. I was raised Seventh-day Adventist, which is, I mean, Advent is in the name. It's very obsessed with all things second coming, the end of time, prophecy. And so I have a lot of baked in assumptions about the end times that I'm having to revisit and try to unwind and figure out how much of this stuff is real, how much of it is tied to these old bad ideas that I used to have. And so for me, I'm kind of obsessed with trying to figure out what's going to happen in the future, both near future and long term, both just out of curiosity and to try to figure out how I need to act accordingly. And it's interesting. I was having this conversation yesterday in the King Pill Discord. We did a voice chat with a group of the guys, and we were talking about this idea of the Whig view of history.
Mm-hmm.
And most people, I'm sure, who are listening to this are probably going to be aware of what that is. Essentially, the notion of perpetual progress and the fact that we live in the future compared to people in the past makes us smarter and better and more educated and essentially better off. That man is perpetually evolving, and it's closely tied with technology being seen as a de facto good, and etc. And what's interesting is a thought kind of occurred to me that there is, speaking of dialectics, there's a correlatory effect here where a lot of people, in rejecting the Whig view of history, have begun espousing the anti-Whig view of history, which is essentially the exact opposite, that everything is getting worse and worse. It's going to continue to get worse and worse. We're on a perpetual downward trend, and we're spiraling toward the end of the world, and it's time to just batten down the hatches and wait for the fire and brimstone to start pouring from heaven. And I, being the skeptic of dialectics that I've become, I have a natural instinct. So that anti-Whig view of history is close. That's a pretty kind of quick and dirty way to describe the Seventh-day Adventist view of the end of time, that things are just going to get worse and worse. So that's kind of what's baked into me, is just kind of a natural pessimism about this world and this life, and that the goal of a Christian is to remain unsullied by the world, and essentially just kind of ride out the tsunami of the end of time. And the end of time is coming at any point, and things are just going to get worse and worse, and it's going to be absolute chaos, and it's going to be the point of greatest darkness and blackness, and that's when the light will show on in the eastern horizon, and Jesus will, yada yada yada. And so I'm now I'm trying to figure out how much of those conceptions of the end of time that I've had are a product of these old flawed traditions of mine, and how much are actually, how much of them do I need to retain and how much do I need to get rid of? And I go back and forth between this. I go back and forth between, things are just going to keep getting worse and worse. The Orthodoxy is just entering a time of great trial and persecution, like the communist revolution on steroids happening on a global scale. And, we need to be ready to hunker down and, protect ours, and, be ready to die for what we believe in. And alternatively, that there's no reason to believe that the end of time is now. Like we live in the end of time, like we live in the final days by dint of the fact that we live after the time of Christ. Because the apostles believed that they lived in the end times, and they did. The church has existed for 2,000 years, living in the end times. We're in the end times, but I don't think there's a particular reason necessarily to believe that the end times means in the next 10 to 50 years any more than it could mean the next 500 to 10,000 years. There's no reason to believe necessarily that the end is nigh, versus we're going through the same cycles of history that have happened before. I mean, you mentioned the 1,000-year period from 500 to 1500. Right about that 1500 point, you'd had a time of a lot of strife and chaos and warfare. You'd had the Crusades. You'd had a lot of factional war going on in Europe. And they were just starting to venture out further and begin exploring a new world. And it was like, we've grown too much for this existing area here. We've outgrown this area. Let's see what's out on the far distant horizon. And so there was people who were taking months and years long voyages to a far and distant land and encountering a whole new world and populating it with their ideas and their people, and kind of starting the world over again. And now here we are. And, if you want to believe that space is real, then we're right on the cusp of beginning an exploration, feeling like we've outgrown the world that we live in and beginning an exploration into a whole new world. And so, like, I guess I'm kind of non-committal right now. I don't know which direction to anticipate. I don't know whether I could see things easily getting really dark. I could also see, like, the collapse of the Roman Empire was a dark and difficult time, but out of it arose a lot of really good stuff. There was a lot of great things about the collapse of the Roman Empire. Specifically, Christian monarchies arose all over Europe and throughout the East as well. And there was a great time of prosperity for a lot of people. The same thing could be coming for us. It could also be, the collapse of the British Empire, which yielded 2 world wars and millions of people dead. So I don't know. Am I allowed to be non-committal?
Yeah, of course. Well, I'm even probably worse than non-committal. I don't even care, right? So
yeah.
for me, it's like thinking about, aside from really nerdy conversations that I like to have about, eschatological times and such, it's as worth worrying about as it is whether or not when I walk out of my front door, I'm going to get hit by a bus. And then, so I never leave my house because I'm so terrified of getting hit by.
Callback.
There's to loop it around, right? But yeah, I mean, honestly, like there's so little focus on that in Orthodoxy, and I think it's because it's such a distraction from, for me, it's a very Western way of thinking to think that, or Western religious way of thinking that, to just constantly plan on how to get out of here. And maybe I was part born this way too, so I'm a little bit like more receptive to it than a lot of people. But the idea that you can really just sort of enjoy your day, enjoy your life, and enjoy what's around you, and be glad you have it. And I wasn't always, I kind of broke myself of that for about 20 years and got like really focused on stupid shit that made me very unhappy. And when I took a step back and relaxed and like pulled myself out of all that to just go for a walk or go for a hike or go for a drive or just talk to other people and get to know other people. Not everybody, because some people are lunatics, but most people I could get to know a little bit. And I think that's more of kind of how if I'm going to be the one as an amateur theologian here to kind of give any advice, it's, if what you're getting out of your religion or your belief system, your way of life, is paralyzing you to being comfortable, and I don't mean comfortable like lazy, like really being comfortable with yourself and who you are and what you're doing. If what you believe in doesn't give you that, then you stop doing that. Just stop. And I'm not talking to you specifically, Matt, but like in general, you know when something's hurting you and when it isn't. And most times people will continue to do the things that hurt them because they're used to it. It's very easy to just, if you're an alcoholic, it's very easy to just keep drinking. Stopping drinking is very, very difficult. Like I smoke cigarettes. Stopping smoking, actually I could stop. I've done it before, kind of cold turkey, but I like it. I don't know why I like it. I think I like it because I don't have to accomplish anything when I'm smoking a cigarette. I can sit outside lazily and stare at the sky and just go like this. It's not good. It's not mentally healthy. It's not physically healthy. So there are all things that we need to break out of. And, kind of like you said, I don't want to ever put myself in a position where I'm trying to play with somebody's mortality or play with somebody's, eschatological beliefs. Like I don't want to put that on anybody, but I think it's worth throwing these ideas out there and letting people kind of digest them, because I would err on the side of talking people out of all of this. Like bat it around in your head, but I don't want you to walk into an Orthodox church, like, unless you feel like Christ is there. If you don't feel like you're being called there, it's not a tourist attraction. There should be a reason that you're going there, because you could be doing real spiritual damage to yourself or to other people. And I certainly don't want to be responsible for that. So kind of like there's passages in the Old Testament where it's sort of said, like, if you don't know if it's an angel or a demon, err on the side of it being a demon, right? Like just assume it is. And then if it isn't, like, the angel will be like, no, it's okay. You did the right thing. You should have assumed it was bad. So I think that's the best advice, like, lay people can kind of give other lay people is, if it doesn't resonate with you, okay, like, it resonates with me, and it resonates with me for the reasons that we laid out. And I think it resonates with you. And maybe we'll do another show another time about politics and monarchies, because we tend to agree on a lot, but I don't know if we'd agree 100% on that stuff. So
I'd wondered if we were going to get into that today. So we should definitely do that another time.
No,
I have a story that.
No, go ahead.
I have a story that we could kind of maybe wrap on. Before that, two points. One is within Orthodoxy. I mean, with just in general, tying off what you were saying. You were talking about, not just showing up there just kind of for funsies, but like to go there because you think that's where you're going to find Christ. Related to that, if you do go to an Orthodox church, they have, especially coming from a Protestant background, it was kind of a little weird to me that they do communion every week. And once I understood the whole concept, it's just a whole, I mean, we could do a whole episode on that.
Right, I get it.
It was also interesting to me that they will not, if you don't, when I was going to go there for the first time, people said, if you're not a baptized member of the Orthodox Church, don't go up and receive communion. And it's not because, like, this is the special thing that's only reserved for the members. It's because this is the body and blood of Christ, and receiving it willy-nilly can actually do harm to you. Going and receiving communion from an Orthodox church without having gone through the process of joining the church will actually harm you. It will cause harm to you. And tied to that idea kind of is also, there's another anecdote, and then I'll tell my story, is the conception of hell. So we have within the West, there's heaven and hell exist in a dialectic tension. And the Orthodox understanding or belief in hell is that heaven and hell are both eternally in the presence of God. So people who are in hell are people who are eternally in the presence of God, and the experience of being eternally in his presence is a hellish experience for them, because they have established throughout their lives that they have rejected him, that they don't want him, that they don't want to be in his presence. So for them, being in the presence of his love is like a burning fire that is burning them, and it's agonizing. They hate it, but this is what they chose. They actively chose to put themselves there. So I think those ideas are kind of connected there, that God is, you can think of God as like a roaring lion or like a burning fire. And those things are really good when they're on your side, and they're really not when they're not. Or when you're on their side, I suppose you should say. Those were just a couple of anecdotes that came to mind as you were talking about that. The story. So we moved to Texas in January, and we had been we decided a while before that we wanted to move to Texas, but we were planning on doing it later this year or next year. We weren't going to leave when we did, but some things changed with us financially, and it became apparent that this was going to be the best move to move now. But throughout the month of December, we were agonizing over whether, like, what we should do. Should we stay in California and just readjust our focus and start doing some different stuff, or should we relocate to Texas? And one of the biggest things that was holding us in California was we had just started attending a church there. And the church that we were attending, we'd been going for maybe 4 months, 3 or 4 months at that time. The church was St. Andrew's Orthodox Church in Riverside, which is, for anybody who's familiar with him, it's the church of Father Josiah Trenum. And so he was my first Orthodox priest, which is, I consider myself abundantly blessed to have had that as my first experience with Orthodoxy. The man is an absolute titan. As we were agonizing over this decision about whether or not to leave, we requested a meeting with him to go sit down and talk with him and kind of present some of what we were thinking and get his counsel, get his feedback. And I knew going in that he wasn't going to tell us, you should do this or you should do that. He wasn't going to say you should stay in California or you should go to Texas. And honestly, I would have had less respect for him if he had. I knew that he was I don't know why, I just kind of knew that he was going to give us counsel on how to make the decision for ourselves, but he wasn't going to make the decision for us. And when we sat with him, we ended up talking with him for almost an hour, which is just, I mean, I will never forget that hour for the rest of my life. Just sitting there in his office, just talking to him. For anyone who's watched him on YouTube, like, you see his videos where he's sitting in his office with his library, his books right behind him. Just imagine him pushing himself back from his desk, turning to his right, and we were sitting right there just talking to him. It was like surreal. Anyway, so he just an absolutely beautiful man. He told us a story. So first of all, we told him kind of what we were thinking, and we were like, should we should we stay here? Should we go? We'll be able to make more money there. But we have the church here, we have family, but we're also really, we're concerned about raising a child in Southern California. And, we don't want to have to deal with the medical system here. And, it seems like things are getting bad. We'd like to go somewhere where we have a better support system, yada, yada, yada. And after listening to us, he kind of sat and thought for a minute. And then he said, the first thing he said was, you guys are going to be just fine. No matter what decision you make, you're going to be just fine. God is going to be with you, whether you stay or whether you go. Now, one thing about orthodoxy, he said, we Orthodox, we don't run. We're not people who flee. We don't try to escape persecution. We stay and we fight for our communities. And he said, he talked about how, the sheriff in Riverside County is he's based, and how, that he encourages his parishioners to be active in their local communities, get involved in their local governments, be on their city councils, be active, have an influence on your community. He said that he doesn't care what happens throughout the rest of California. He said, Riverside we are going to, I don't remember exactly what he said, but the idea was essentially like, we are going to maintain a hold on Riverside, because this is where, like, our responsibility as Orthodox Christians is to stay in Riverside and save Riverside. At the same time, he said, Texas is fantastic. There's a litany of fantastic churches in Texas. His bishop is in the bishop who ordained him is in Kansas, so his territory includes all of Texas. And he's like, I can give you priests to connect you to, depending on where you end up. If you decide to go there, that's a great decision. You're going to be just fine. But then he told us a story, and he said, now I don't remember some of the exact details of it, because he told us a lot of stuff, and I just didn't retain all of it. But if I remember correctly, this was something that happened in Eastern Europe, and it was one of his like mentors or a priest who had a big influence on him was the one who had told him the story because it had happened to him, to that other priest. So he's serving the liturgy on a normal, ordinary Sunday, and the back door of the church opens, and a woman comes in, and she's just sobbing, just wailing, and completely distraught. And she's kind of disrupting the service. And so he sends a deacon out and says, hey, go, just tell her to go outside the church. And as soon as I'm done, I'll come out. I promise, as soon as I'm finished serving the liturgy, I'll come out and I'll attend to her and help her with whatever she needs. So he goes out and he tells her, she goes out of the church. So at the end of the liturgy, this priest goes out and says, what's going on? Like, what's up? What's wrong? And she is just sobbing. And she says, Father, just, every single thing that my husband and I have set our minds to, we've been successful with. Our farm is just wildly successful, generating crops like you wouldn't believe. Our children have all grown up. They've all married wonderful people. They've got children. They're all successful in every single thing that they do. All of our friends are fantastic. We're perfectly settled for the rest of our lives. We have nothing to complain about. We have nothing to ask for. Our lives are perfect. There's no issues. We have nothing that we could complain about. There's nothing that we could possibly ask for. And she looked at him, and I will never forget his face as he was telling us this story. He's like very dramatically acting out the whole thing. And she just looks up at him, just tears are streaming down her face, looks up at him and says, Father, God has abandoned us. And then he just throws his head back and just roars, just laughing. And he said, in the West, we can't comprehend suffering. We have no idea what suffering is in the West. In the East, they know suffering. And they know that if they're not suffering, they're not growing. That suffering is the tool that God uses to mold and grow us. Suffering is a gift. It's something to be cherished. And I haven't been able to forget that story ever since he told it to us. That like that's to this woman, the fact that they were so blessed that there was nothing, like think of the story of Job. Like there is nothing that they could ask for. They were experiencing no resistance in their life in anything that they did. And to her, that was an indicator that God had abandoned them. Because in her mind, she recognized the presence of God through the existence of obstacles and persecution and stress and barriers that she would have to exercise faith to overcome. And that without those standing in her way, her faith was going to deteriorate and she was going to fall away from God. That's a perspective that is completely and utterly foreign to anyone in the West.
Yeah, I mean, that's a beautiful story. I mean, what a good way to kind of explain Phronema there for people listening who have never heard it before. I was thinking of another story I heard. This wasn't one that was told specifically to me, but I'll reiterate it the best I can. And you may have heard of it if we listen to some of the same content. But there is a monastery in a far corner of the world, and down below where the visitors would kind of come and check in before they could go up and see the monks or progress along the high reaching steps that would go up to the monastery from the ground below. There was one monk down there who would greet all the people, and he was a lifetime alcoholic. And the reason that the head of the monastery put him down there was somewhat lost on the rest of the monks, who would very much like to have been in that position to be the very first person that somebody saw when they were coming to visit the monastery. So they would often inquire, why does this monk who drinks himself into a stupor every night after his work is over, why does he get to do this? And they never really received an inadequate answer, but they always kind of held a grudge, were a little bit upset that they saw this sinner down there and he was taking their place. Well, one day the monk who's the alcoholic who's greeting the folks down below passes away, is given to God. And one of the monks sees it, and he comes and he goes over to the father of the abbey and says, the monk who drinks all the time, father, he died. And the head of the abbey says, oh, I know. I saw the angels carrying him away to heaven. And the monk goes, the angels carrying him away to heaven? He's an alcoholic. He's been drinking it. He said, listen, let me explain it to you. When he first came to the monastery 20 years ago, he was drinking 25 drinks a day. And every year on Passover, on Easter, he would give up one. So over the years, he went from 20 drinks to 19 drinks to 18 drinks to 16 drinks. And when he died, he was only having 4 drinks a day. And the angels took him to heaven. So for anyone who's a Western Christian or Western, really anything, atheist, and you don't understand Matt's story about struggle, what the struggle means, and are quick to judge people who we think are doing evil things, we don't know what's going on in someone's heart. We don't know the struggle that they're going through. We don't know how close they are to God. And it's not really up to us. What's up to us, I believe, is to turn our view inward and to work on our own struggle and to ask for help and to know that we are not evil. We are not damned. We are not ruined. We are not hopeless. That God is, not only did he create us to be with him, the whole purpose of being here is to go back to him. And that's what he wants. He will not drag you kicking and screaming to him in any way, but he will receive you when you're ready, and you do not have to be perfect. So from one amateur theologian to anybody who's caring or listening, those two stories might be a really good way to sum up what may have sounded like a very academic conversation at some point. So
I was just trying to figure out how to fit in a my struggle. Like I'm going to write a book called My Struggle. I was trying to figure out how to fit that in there, but I couldn't think of something before you finished. But I think that was a good way to wrap it up.
I'm not going to do a plug because I don't have anything to plug. So
you've got our Twitter accounts are on the screen. You can go follow us.
And I tweeted a little bit last night just because my girlfriend went to bed and I just wanted to jazz my brain up a little bit. So I figured I'm just going to I don't even remember what I picked out. The three first things that I saw. I think you were one of them. I commented on them and I'm like, I'm going to look at these in the morning and they're going to juice me up so I can do a show. And then I totally forgot to look at them.
I didn't notice that you'd replied to something. I need to go see what you said.
Don't even worry about it because whatever it is, it's just silliness that was designed to like goose people up. And the whole point was that I would go back and I would see them goosed up and I'd be all ready for the show. And I didn't do any of that. So everybody could just ignore anything that I said last night. But, hopefully there'll be some episodes of King Pill coming out. And hopefully there'll be some episodes of what I hope to call the Age of Information, the rebrand of You're Talking Over Me coming out. I'll race you to see who doesn't do it first.
Deal.
All right, bud. I guess that's it. Let's talk soon.
All right. Sounds good.
All right. Cheers.